At night, the church walls began to breathe again, slowly, like a sick chest, as if someone inside hadn't died but only fallen asleep. Old Helene says she heard someone call her name through the stone, in the voice of her sister buried there 40 years ago. It began with a sound no one wanted to name, just after midnight, always soft at first, like knuckles dragging against centuries-old stone. If you were awake in St. Eugenius past the 12th bell, and if you were brave or foolish enough to stand near the altar where the north transept met the nave, you would hear it. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, from inside the wall. Father Morin had never spoken of it directly, not in homilies, not in confession, not even to the young deacons who whispered behind his back about the nights he spent walking the church floor in silence. He'd simply pause some evenings, standing still beneath the crucifix, his head tilted slightly as if listening. And then he'd move on, as though hearing nothing. But they all knew. They all knew something was buried there, and not just bone. St. Eugenius was older than the town around it. The stone of the apse was darker, rougher than the rest of the structure, quarried in another century, hauled by men who'd never heard of the war that came 100 years later. The earliest records were lost in the fire of 1896, and the surviving ones, weather-warped in a vault behind the vestry, only picked up after the reconstruction. There were gaps no historian could explain. The plans showed the walls as solid, load-bearing, untouched for over 100 years. But sometimes the plaster cracked in strange places. Sometimes, on cold nights, the scent of myrrh and damp earth seemed to leak out from the seams. Sister Eliane had been the first to ask outright, her voice low, lips barely moving, as if the stone itself might be listening. "Why don't we open the wall?" she'd asked Father Morin one October morning, staring at the narrow length of limestone between the stained glass and the side altar. "If something's trapped," she hadn't finished the sentence. He looked at her a long time before replying. "Because it was sealed under the rite. And the rite binds both ways." She never asked again. They said the knocks came more often now, every night, not just during Lent or on the eve of St. Agnes when the veil thinned. Parishioners would linger too long after Vespers and leave with eyes wide, hands cold. One woman claimed she heard a whisper through the stone, something like a hymn sung backward. A janitor quit without notice, leaving behind his keys and a note with no words, only a drawing of a hand, thin, gnarled, pressing out from inside a wall. By the time the diocesan investigator arrived, Father Morin was already gone. Not dead, just gone. The sacristan found his vestments neatly folded on the floor beside the pulpit. His rosary draped over the marble edge, a single bead missing. No sign of a struggle, no signs at all. It was as though he'd walked into the air and disappeared. The bishop sent a replacement, of course, a younger man, Father Kalin, full of soft skepticism and theological certainty. He laughed gently when someone mentioned the knocking, quoted Augustine, and ordered an electrician to check for faulty pipes. The electrician left before finishing. Said he wouldn't work after dark. Claimed his tools went missing. Claimed he heard something breathing through the wall. The last time anyone saw Father Kalin, he was walking barefoot through the nave, muttering in Latin not found in any liturgy. The next morning, the church was empty again. But the knocking remained. The parish refused to close, though attendance dropped. Those who stayed were mostly older, those who had lost something, or someone, or simply knew better than to question silence. One woman, Odile, came every day. She never Saturday. Just stood by the wall with her ear pressed to the stone, whispering prayers from a century no one else remembered. She said she saw her daughter's face once in the candlelight, reflected not on glass, but from inside the limestone. Everyone knew the story, though no one told it the same. That there had been a girl, once. Long before the fire. Some said she was a novice nun, barely 17, who had refused to recant a vision. Others claimed she was a pilgrim who accused the wrong priest. There were older stories too, older than paper, about a heretic buried alive for a secret gospel. But all the stories agreed on one thing: she had been sealed in the wall. Not just to hide her. To contain her. The wall was consecrated, they said, not by choice, but by necessity. One winter, the marble near the side altar began to weep. Not water, something darker, something thicker. The lab said it was animal blood, but couldn't say from what species. The bishop's office sent no more replacements. They stopped returning calls. That was when Elian returned, no longer a sister, no longer in a habit, just a woman with trembling hands and a worn-out prayer book. She came every night, and every night she brought a hammer. She didn't use it. She only placed it on the floor before the wall and knelt beside it, as if offering it, as if waiting for permission. And still, the knocking came. 3 times. Every night. Always from the same spot. It was early March when the first hole appeared. Not from Elian's hammer, she had never touched it again, but from within. A splintering sound rang out during Lauds, sharp and abrupt like bones snapping under weight, and when the sacristan came to light the candles that morning, he found a crack in the plaster, narrow as a needle, running vertically down the wall beneath the icon of Saint Dymphna. The crack wept a pale, oily resin that smelled faintly of frankincense and rot. No one dared patch it. Elian stopped bringing the hammer after that. She no longer knelt. She stood now, and her prayers had changed. No longer the soft litanies of a faithful penitent. Now she muttered fragments of psalms, broken into strange rhythms, half-remembered and misquoted. Deep calls to deep, she whispered one night, but the Lord does not answer from the whirlwind. The organ began to play by itself on Fridays. Just a few chords, sometimes a dissonant hymn no one could name, sometimes a perfect, simple melody that made your throat close and your eyes water for reasons you couldn't explain. The pipes had been sealed for maintenance after Father Kalin's disappearance, the keys locked inside the vestry drawer. But the music came all the same. By April, the wall had changed. The stone beneath the crack had taken on a bloom, dark and bruised like the skin of a fruit left too long in the sun. The scent of old incense had grown stronger, mixing with a damp, earthy musk that clung to the cassocks and robes like mildew. Some said it was just age. Others said it was breath. And then came the girl. She appeared during a weekday mass, quiet, ordinary, with only 6 parishioners present. She entered just before the homily, barefoot, dressed in a grey shift soaked through with rain. No one had seen her arrive. She took a seat in the back pew and stared at the altar without blinking. When the priest, an old Monsignor brought out of retirement to keep the masses going, asked if she was all right, she didn't speak. Didn't move. Just raised her hand and pointed. At the wall. One of the parishioners, Mrs. Delort, who'd buried her husband the year before, swore she saw the girl's lips moving. Not in French. Not in Latin. Something older. Something sharper. By the time the Monsignor turned to look again, the girl was gone. The seat was wet with rain. But there were no footprints on the stone floor. After that, the parishioners stopped sitting near the wall. Some stopped coming altogether. The rest brought salt in their pockets and touched their fingers to the holy water font 3 times instead of once. The sacristan refused to light the candles in the north transept. The Monsignor never raised his voice above a whisper during Mass. And Elian began sleeping in the church. Not inside the rectory. Not in the cloisters. On the cold stone floor before the wall. She knocks because we left her there, Elian said to the Monsignor one night, her voice cracking like thin ice underfoot. She was innocent. And they walled her in as if silence could sanctify a lie. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask when. Because he had already seen it. 2 nights before, while closing the nave, he paused to snuff the candles and caught movement, just the briefest impression in the periphery. A shifting behind the stained glass, as though someone were walking inside the wall. When he turned, he saw the outline, a hand, pressed flat against the plaster, leaving behind a faint, dark stain that dried within seconds. The next morning, he began leaving the church unlocked. If she wants out, he said softly, we can't keep pretending the nails are still in place. The bishop sent word again, not with priests this time, but with architects and 2 men from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Their suits were gray. Their crucifixes plain and small, worn under the shirt, not above. They asked no questions. They spoke to no one but Elian. And the conversation was short. One of them left the next morning. The other stayed. Not in the rectory. Not in the cloisters. He stayed with Elian, sitting beside her at night, both of them watching the wall, listening to the knocks, 3, every night, as constant as a heart. And then, one night in June, there was a fourth. Not louder. Not different in rhythm. Just, one more than there should have been. The man from the Vatican stood immediately. His face was grey with sweat. He knelt before the wall, not in prayer, but as though examining a door that had shifted in its frame. He placed his ear to the stone. And whatever he heard made him recoil. He said nothing. He left that night. Didn't pack. Didn't bless himself. And the next morning, the crack in the wall had widened. Elaine didn't sleep that night. She stood, one hand on the plaster, and whispered something that made the candle sputter. The flame near the tabernacle blew out entirely. And when the sacristan lit it again at dawn, the air around the altar was colder than ice. They say the knocking has changed now, not just in number, but in sound. Sometimes it's fast. Sometimes, it's not knocking at all. Sometimes, it's scraping. The kind of sound that makes you think of teeth on porcelain, or fingernails blindly clawing their way through wood. Not loud, not even urgent, just steady. A patience so complete it felt inhuman. No rhythm. No intention to be heard. Just the act itself, the sound of persistence. Elaine stopped speaking altogether by midsummer. Her mouth moved, but no voice came. Her eyes had gone pale and glassy, always fixed slightly off from where people stood, like she was listening to someone behind them. She ate little. Slept less. And every day she traced the same line on the wall with the tip of her finger, the edge of the crack, now wider than a hand. You could see into it if the light hit just right, just a slit of blackness, the kind that makes you feel like something is watching from inside. Not the way you watch something. The way something waits for you. When the pilgrim came, no one was surprised. He arrived in silence, walking up the road barefoot in the heat, robes the color of rust and ash, hands bandaged to the wrist. The children whispered that he had no name. That his feet left no prints in the dust. He asked no questions. Spoke to no one. Just stood at the threshold of St. Eugenia's and looked at the steeple for nearly an hour, the bell silent above him. Then he went inside, and did not leave. The doors stayed open. No one tried to stop him. Not the sacristan. Not the Monsignor, who now sat always in the rearmost pew, head bowed, clutching a crucifix that had begun to splinter down the center. Even the few who still came to Mass, those who hadn't yet fled to the next parish or stopped believing entirely, recognized the quiet finality of it. The pilgrim lit no candles. Took no host. He walked directly to the wall, brushed his knuckles across the crack, and knelt. Then he began to speak. It wasn't French. Nor Latin. The words were low and wet and slow, like something rising up through a well. The syllables carried weight, falling into the air with the force of stones tossed into still water. The crack trembled slightly. Just once. Enough to make the statue of the Virgin shudder where it stood nearby. Enough to make the thin dust fall in a curtain from the rafters. That night, the organ played again. Not a melody. Just one note. Held for 12 minutes. Elaine knelt beside the pilgrim and mimicked his prayer silently, her lips moving in tandem with his, though her voice never returned. The candle flames bent toward the wall. The air smelled of turned soil and old wine. And all across the nave, you could feel it, that something was paying attention. The next day, 3 more cracks appeared. No one repaired them. The sacristan had left, finally, without taking his things. The Monsignor hadn't spoken in days. He simply sat in his pew and bled slowly from his ears, the blood thin and dark, as if something were loosening inside him. The bishop's office stopped responding. There were no more replacements. The church bells no longer rang. But still, the knocking came. It was different now. Sometimes it came during the day. Sometimes, it came from more than one place. People in town began to report strange things. Not visions, nothing cinematic or sweet. No angels, no weeping statues. Just an unease that sank into the floorboards of their homes. Dreams of stone and breath and cold, damp hands. Salt lines drawn across windows kept curling inwards. Bibles left on bedside tables flipped open to blank pages. Dogs howled at dusk and would not be calmed. The parish remaining faithful, the ones too old or too proud or too scared to abandon the church entirely, started gathering outside the church in the evenings, not going in, just standing with candles and crosses and old songs on their tongues. But the songs were weak. The flames blew sideways even when the air was still. Some began to say it wasn't her knocking anymore. That someone else had answered. Inside the church, the pilgrim never left his place at the wall. He had stopped speaking. Now he just listened. Elian sat beside him, her eyes closed, her lips split from dryness, a long thread of blood constantly trailing from her left nostril. They both looked thinner, like the stone was drawing something out of them. But they didn't die. They didn't even sleep. They just waited. And the knocking continued. Sometimes fast. Sometimes slow. Sometimes so soft it was almost kind. And sometimes, when you stood close enough, when the light was right, when the church was otherwise silent, you could hear something behind it. Breathing. It was in early September when the breathing became unmistakable. Not just a sensation or trick of the ear. It was real now, wet and slow and wrong. As if something inside the wall had lungs but not lungs like ours. The sound was heavy, like bellows dragging water through cloth. Parishioners who ventured too close staggered back with their hands over their mouths. One woman, Sylvie Brew, collapsed during Mass, convulsing on the tiles, her body twisting with such force her shoulder popped from its socket. She was conscious the whole time, eyes wide, locked on the cracked wall. They sealed her in without the sacrament, she whispered afterward, her voice torn and shredded. They didn't bury her. They starved her. She died 3 days later. No wounds. Just stopped breathing mid-sentence, eyes open, mouth parted as though she had something more to say. The undertaker refused to take her body inside the church for rites. They held the funeral in the gravel lot beside the parish hall. When the coffin was lowered, the priest's hands trembled so badly he dropped the aspergillum. No one picked it up. Inside, the pilgrim finally stood. No one saw him rise. He was kneeling one moment, and standing the next, his face hollow, the cloth of his robe soaked black from the knees down, though there had been no rain. Elian rose with him, her bones cracking audibly, her fingers raw where she had been tracing the stone. Her mouth opened wide, and for the first time in over a month, she made a sound. It was not a word. It was a sob. Not human. Not grief. Something remembering. That night, the wall opened. It didn't break. It didn't collapse. It simply gave way, as though it had never been solid to begin with. The stone around the central crack crumbled in silence, revealing a cavity no more than 4 feet wide and impossibly deep. There were no remains. No wood, no bones, no cloth. Just space. Darkness. And the smell. That smell, hot blood, turned soil, incense long burnt. It rushed out like steam from a tomb. Candles throughout the nave extinguished without wind. The windows fogged over from the inside. Somewhere, the organ released a single low moan, like an animal yawning in pain. Elian stepped forward first. She didn't look at the others. Didn't wait for the pilgrim, who stood as if rooted in place. She reached into the cavity with both hands, palms up. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. From recognition. And something reached back. Not visible. Not a hand. Just presence. A pull. You could see her skin change, flush gray at first, then blanch to a deathly white. Her eyes rolled, and blood buzzed from the corners of her mouth. But she did not scream. She didn't collapse. She just leaned in, as though greeting an old friend from across a long winter. Then came the voice. No one could say if it was in the room or in their heads. But every person inside the church that night, 8 parishioners, the Monsignor, the pilgrim, would later say the same thing. It was a woman's voice. Calm. Young. Patient. And it said only this. Now you remember me. Then the wind came, if you could call it that. A gust from inside the cavity, bone cold and full of ash. It poured across the altar, lifting vestments from the hooks, tearing pages from hymnals. The Monsignor collapsed where he stood. One woman screamed. A man vomited blood into the collection plate. The pilgrim finally moved. But not toward the wall. He turned to the congregation, eyes wild, mouth open, but whatever words he tried to speak caught in his throat like stones. Instead, he reached for the sanctuary lamp, still flickering near the tabernacle. He lifted it high and hurled it toward the cavity. It shattered. The oil burst, the flame caught. For a moment, the light filled the church, and they all saw it. Not a girl. Not bones. A shape, deep inside the recess. Almost human. Bent forward, as if it had been kneeling for centuries. Skin stretched tight, eyes hollow but open. And a mouth, not screaming. Smiling. Then the light went out. Smoke thickened the air. The fire did not spread. The altar cloth caught and went black around the edges, but nothing burned further. The smoke stayed low to the ground, creeping outward like it was crawling. The cavity swallowed the last of the light, then closed. The stone seemed to ripple, as if breathing in reverse. When the wall was whole again, the crack was gone. But the knocking did not stop. Now it came from everywhere. The floors. The rafters. The tabernacle itself. 3 knocks. Then 4. Then 3 again. Then silence. The next morning, no one spoke. The pilgrim had vanished. Elian was still kneeling, hands raw and open, eyes fixed not on the wall, but on the crucifix above the altar. She hadn't blinked in hours. And across the nave, carved into the stone just below the statue of Saint Eugenia, was a single sentence, fresh, sharp, and etched deeper than any chisel could reach. She will knock until someone lets her in. It ended, quietly, on a Wednesday. The sun rose flat and pale, filtered through low-hanging mist that clung to the stone like breath held too long. No bells rang. No birdsong. Just the slow creak of the sacristy door as Elian, barefoot and dust-covered, walked once more to the nave. She was alone. The Monsignor had been taken 2 days prior, whispers of a seizure, though no hospital would claim his body. The last parishioner had left the week before, found sobbing in her garden with salt crusted into her palms. The bishop's men had stopped writing. The church was forgotten. Elian wore no habit now. Just a simple linen gown, once white, now gray and worn thin. She no longer trembled. No longer whispered. Her body, frail and translucent with hunger, moved with a stillness that felt deliberate, like someone moving through the rooms of a house long since emptied of life. She walked to the wall. The wall was smooth now. No crack. No mark. No trace of where the cavity had been. And yet, each night, the knocking had continued. It had grown softer. Not weaker, just more patient. More assured. Like someone who knew the door would open. Eventually, Elian reached the place where the wall had once split and placed both hands flat against the stone. Her fingers were bleeding again. She had taken to walking the church in circles, pressing her fingertips to every surface until they split. She closed her eyes. There was no sound. Then, 3 knocks. Steady. Gentle. Elian opened her mouth. No words. Just a long exhale, soft and heavy. A breath returned after years of silence. Then she leaned forward and kissed the stone. It gave. Not suddenly. Not violently. Like warm wax beneath a candle. Like water taking back its shape. The wall softened, bowed, and folded inward, opening not to blackness this time, but to light. Not brilliant. Not holy. Just dim, golden, like candlelight through old curtains. A light that flickered as if cast by a flame too deep to see. She stepped inside. No resistance. No fear. The stone closed behind her like a sigh. And that was it. No explosion. No tremor. Just silence. The next morning, the church was empty. The wall was whole. And the knocking had stopped. Forever. The villagers say the church still stands, but none go near. The doors remain closed. The iron gate rusted shut. Moss has overtaken the stones, ivy curled like veins across the old bell tower. But sometimes, when the fog is low and the air is still, those who pass on the road say they hear something, not knocking. Not voices. Just breath. A soft, slow rhythm. As though something, someone, is asleep inside. Waiting to be remembered again.